Why does it always seem as though there were a big disconnect between the life of faith and everyday life? Wouldn't it be great if we could figure out how to connect everyday life in the world with life in the kingdom so that the two were not in constant conflict yet still clearly distinct from one another? Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Thursday, August 25th. 2022. Once again, this week we're looking at an important book by theologian H. Richard Niebuhr called Christ and Culture. Written over 70 years ago, it remains an insightful analysis of the history of the Christian church seen through the lens of how the church has come to terms with the tension between the Christian community and the various cultures in which different Christian communities exist. Yesterday, we took a very brief look at the strategy Niebuhr calls Christ of culture. This approach tends to view Christian faith and culture as largely in sync with one another, where Christ functions as a sort of great moral teacher, and the gospel affirms the best and highest impulses and achievements of society. The obvious problem with this approach is that it too closely identifies human achievement with the kingdom of God, and it fails to take seriously the reality of human sin. It also tends to subordinate the gospel to human knowledge and experience. Now, if the Christ against culture and the Christ of culture approaches form the polar extremes in Niebuhr's analysis, he sees three approaches that he identifies as median approaches. And the first of these is what he calls the Christ above culture model. The virtue of the Christ above culture model is that it takes seriously several important ideas. It understands that sin is both radical and universal. That is, sin is found within everyone and within every social structure. It understands that as the creator of all things, God is intimately involved in the life of the world and cares deeply about it. It understands that the same God who created all things is present in Jesus Christ, who redeems sinful humanity. And it understands that people, all people, are inescapably part of culture. There is no way to truly escape life in the world, even if this were a worthy goal in life. The Christ above culture model holds these things in common with the other two median positions, which we'll take up over the next couple of days, but the Christ above culture model does something else. Like the radical model of Christ against culture, it takes the hard commands of Jesus seriously. But unlike the Christ against culture model, it doesn't see these hard commands as practical for ordinary Christians who have to live in the world as it is. The solution to the tension between Christian faith and life in the world, then, is to conceive of the kingdom of God as perfect, and the world as a kind of imperfect reflection of the kingdom. In this way, life in the world can be correlated with life in the kingdom as a sort of lesser form of the kingdom. Niebuhr uses a lovely analogy for this model based, appropriate enough, on medieval European life. Referring to the way the great Thomas Aquinas developed the system, he says, Aquinas combined without confusing philosophy and theology, state and church, civic and Christian virtues, natural and divine laws, Christ and culture. Out of these various elements, he built a great structure of theoretical and practical wisdom, which, like a cathedral, was solidly planted among the streets and marketplaces, the houses, palaces, and universities that represent human culture, but which, when one had passed through the doors, presented a strange new world of quiet spaciousness, of sounds and colors, actions and figures, symbolic of a life beyond all secular concerns. The glue that holds this scheme together is the idea that in the world we learn different kinds of virtues. As we learn and develop these basic virtues, honesty, basic kindness to our fellow human being, and so on, we grow and develop and become better able to progress into higher virtues. Christ himself becomes in this scheme our moral tutor who equips us more and more to live a highly virtuous life. Within this scheme, the church, and especially those who live in monastic communities, become exemplars of the higher virtues. The goal of this life is an ever-increasing attainment of virtue. Or to put the whole thing differently, life in the world is seen as an analogy to life in the kingdom, with the world being an imperfect analog to the kingdom. The only problem with this scheme is that it tends to identify whatever culture the believer inhabits as the only valid form of culture, so that it begins to morph into a Christ of culture scheme, eager to defend the present form of culture against change because it has so closely identified the particular culture as the true analog of the kingdom. Still, this scheme has the great virtue of taking life in the world seriously without confusing the best and highest in culture with the kingdom of God. It enables ordinary Christians to understand how their lives in the world relate to the kingdom that is to come. It's an elegant solution to the tension between Christ and culture, between Christian faith and life in the world, but it is not the only way to work through the tension between the two. When we return tomorrow, we'll take up the second of Niebuhr's median types, one that sets church and world in a paradoxical relationship. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do, this day and in all the days ahead.